The 1930s closed not with a whimper, but with the rising scream of supercharged engines. To a young person in Middle America, the air age had been about mail planes and daredevils in biplanes. But across the Atlantic and Pacific, the sky was being forged into a battlefield. It was a time when the world was shrinking, and the only thing faster than the news of war was the technology designed to wage it. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship or in the middle of a London street, looking up. The clouds were no longer just weather, they were cover. For the United States, the distance of the oceans offered a false sense of security that evaporated the moment the first radar blips appeared over Oahu. The era of the battleship was sinking, and the era of the fighter pilot, the modern knight in a flight suit, was born. This wasn't just a war of soldiers, it was a war of slide rules and drafting boards. Engineering became as lethal as any bullet. If your engine coughed 20,000 feet, or if your wings couldn't handle a high G turn, you didn't just lose a battle, you lost a generation of potential. The greatest generation found their wings in machines made of aluminum, high-octane fuel, and pure grit. In the chapters that follow, we look at the 7 mechanical titans that defined the conflict. These weren't just vehicles, they were the extensions of the men who flew them. From the sun-drenched Pacific to the frozen heights over Germany, these aircraft decided which flags would fly when the smoke finally cleared. This is the story of how the sky was won, one dogfight at a time. The P-51 Mustang, the savior of the 8th. By 1943, the American air campaign over Europe was in a death spiral. The flying fortresses were supposed to be invulnerable, but German interceptors were carving them out of the sky faster than they could be replaced. The problem was simple and terrifying. American fighters didn't have the legs to go the distance. Once the escorts turned back for fuel, the bombers were sitting ducks. The P-51 Mustang didn't start as a legend. In fact, its first version was considered a disappointment at high altitudes. It was a sleek, beautiful airframe trapped with an engine that couldn't breathe in the thin air over Germany. It was the ultimate what-if of the early war, a thoroughbred horse with the lungs of a smoker. The miracle happened when the British suggested swapping the American engine for the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Suddenly, the Mustang didn't just fly, it soared. It became the Cadillac of the skies, a plane that could fly from England to Berlin and back without breaking a sweat. For the bomber crews below, the sight of a P-51 Silver Wing was the sight of life itself. Pilots like Don Blakesley didn't just escort, they hunted. They were given the ultimate freedom to leave the bombers and attack the Luftwaffe at their airfields. The Mustang's cockpit was a masterpiece of visibility, featuring the bubble canopy that allowed a pilot to see 360 degrees of danger. It turned the hunter into the hunted. The Mustang represented American industrial might at its peak. We didn't just build a good plane, we mass-produced a masterpiece. It was fast enough to catch a meshsmith and stable enough for a rookie to fly. In the hands of an ace, it was a surgical instrument of war that effectively broke the back of the German Air Force. As the war neared the end, the Mustang was the undisputed king. It proved that in aerial warfare, range is the ultimate weapon. Without the P-51, the invasion of Normandy might never have had the air cover it needed to succeed. It remains the most iconic silhouette of American air power, a symbol of what happens when Allied cooperation hits its stride. The Supermarine Spitfire, the elliptical defender. The Spitfire is more than a plane to the British, it's a national monument. But for Americans, it holds a special place as the machine that kept the light of democracy flickering when the rest of Europe had gone dark. Before Pearl Harbor, American boys who were itching for a fight snuck across the border to Canada or traveled to England to join the Eagle squadrons. They learned to fly in the Spitfire, and they learned to love it. Its wings were its signature, a perfect semi-elliptical shape that made it the most beautiful aircraft in the sky. But that beauty was functional. Those wings allowed the Spitfire to turn tighter than almost anything the Germans could throw at it. In a dogfight, if you were in a Spit, you didn't just follow the enemy, you outmaneuvered them until they were in your sights. During the Battle of Britain, the Spitfire was the high-altitude specialist. While the rugged Hurricanes dealt with the lumbering bombers, the Spitfires stayed high, tangling with the German escorts. It was a gentleman's plane with a killer's bite, armed with 8 machine guns that could saw a wing off in a 3-second burst. The narrative of the Spitfire is one of constant evolution. As the Germans upgraded their planes, the British upgraded the Spitfire. It went through 24 different marks or versions. It grew larger engines, heavier cannons, and even clipped wings for low-level missions. It was the only Allied fighter to be in frontline service from the first day of the war to the very last. For an American pilot, flying a Spitfire was like driving a Ferrari after being used to a truck. It was sensitive, twitchy, and required a delicate touch. It represented the old world fighting back with sophisticated grace. It was the shield that held the line until the American industrial giant could fully wake up and join the fray. The Spitfire's legacy is cemented in the summer of 1940, but its service spanned every theater. It flew in the deserts of North Africa and the jungles of Burma. It proved that a great design doesn't die. It adapts. To this day, the sound of a Spitfire's Merlin engine is the sound of freedom to anyone who knows the history of the 20th century. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, the predator of the Reich. To appreciate the courage of Allied pilots, you have to understand the terror of the Bf-109. This was the primary weapon of the Luftwaffe, a plane designed by Willy Messerschmitt to be the smallest possible airframe wrapped around the largest possible engine. It was a pilot's plane in the most dangerous sense. It was difficult to land, cramped inside, and utterly lethal in a dive. For most of the war, the Bf-109 was the benchmark. It used fuel injection, which meant that while Allied engines might sputter and cough if the pilot pushed the nose down too fast, causing a negative G cutout, the 109 could simply dive away. This technical advantage allowed German pilots to dictate the terms of engagement for years. The Bf-109 was the mount of the aces of aces. Men like Erich Hartmann, who claimed 352 victories, did so largely in this machine. For an American pilot in a P-47 or P-51, seeing the narrow, angular silhouette of a 109 meant you were in for the fight of your life. It didn't look like a bird. It looked like a shard of glass falling from the sun. However, the 109 had a fatal flaw, its narrow landing gear. More 109s were lost in landing accidents on the ground than many squadrons lost in the air. It was a temperamental beast that demanded total concentration. As the war dragged on and Germany's pilot quality dropped, the 109 became a death trap for the inexperienced boys being rushed to the front. Despite its flaws, the 109 was a masterpiece of upgradability. It started the war as a light skirmisher and ended it as a heavily armed interceptor carrying rockets and 30mm cannons meant to blow B-17s out of the sky. It was the persistent shadow over Europe, the black night that had to be unseated before the war could end. The story of the Bf-109 is a cautionary tale of engineering pushed to its absolute limit. It was a plane that stayed in the fight long after it should have been obsolete, through sheer mechanical stubbornness and the skill of the men who flew it. It remains the most produced fighter in history, a testament to its effectiveness as a tool of war. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the Paper Tiger. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the world learned the name Zero. To the Americans, the Japanese were thought to have inferior technology, but the Zero shattered that myth instantly. It was faster, climbed better, and could outturn anything in the U.S. inventory. It was the Phantom of the Pacific, appearing out of nowhere with a range that seemed impossible. The Zero achieved its legendary performance through a ruthless sacrifice: weight. It had no armor plating for the pilot and no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was built of a top-secret aluminum alloy that was incredibly light but also incredibly fragile. In a dogfight, the Zero was a dancer, effortlessly looping behind American wildcats that were trying their best just to keep up. For the first 2 years of the Pacific War, the Zero was the undisputed master. U.S. Navy pilots had to invent entirely new tactics, like the tatch weave, where 2 planes would fly in a crisscross pattern to bait the Zero into a trap. You couldn't beat a Zero by turning with it. You had to dive, shoot, and run away before it could react. The narrative of the Zero is one of tragic stagnation. While the U.S. developed the Hellcat and the Corsair, the Japanese struggled to improve the Zero. By 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot proved that the Zero's day was over. American pilots, now in better protected planes, found that a single burst of gunfire would cause a Zero to explode in a ball of flame. There is a haunting beauty to the Zero. It represented a philosophy of offense at all costs. Its pilots were expected to be so skilled that they would never be hit. A philosophy that worked until they met the overwhelming firepower of American industrial production. It was the sword of the samurai in an age of machine guns. The Zero remains a symbol of the early dark days of the war for the U.S. It is a reminder that technical brilliance can be undone by a lack of durability. It began the war as a symbol of imperial triumph and ended it as a tragic tool for kamikaze missions, a fall from grace that mirrors the empire that built it. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, the fork-tailed devil. When the P-38 Lightning first arrived in Europe, German pilots didn't know what to make of it. With its 2 engines and twin tail booms, it looked like a flying ladder, but they quickly learned to fear it. They called it the fork-tailed devil, not just because of its shape, but because of its terrifying ability to appear out of the clouds and deliver a concentrated punch of fire. The P-38 was unique because its guns were all in the nose. Most fighters had guns in the wings, which meant the bullets had to converge at a certain distance. The P-38's guns fired straight ahead like a sniper rifle. If a P-38 pilot got you in his sights, he didn't just hit you, he shredded you. In the Pacific, the P-38 became the weapon of choice for the top American aces, Richard Bong and Tony Maguire. Its 2 engines gave pilots a sense of security over the vast, empty reaches of the ocean. If one engine took a hit or failed, you could still limp home on the other. For a pilot 500 miles from the nearest landing strip, those 2 engines were a psychological lifeline. The most famous mission in P-38 history was the interception of Admiral Yamamoto. It was a feat of navigation and timing that seems impossible today. Flying long distances at low altitude to avoid radar, the P-38s found their target with second-by-second precision. It was the surgical strike of World War II, proving that the Lightning could strike anywhere, anytime. The P-38 was also a versatile workhorse. It was used for photo reconnaissance, dive bombing, and even as a pathfinder for other bombers. It was the high-tech marvel of its day, featuring a pressurized cockpit and turbo superchargers that allowed it to fight effectively at altitudes where other planes struggled to stay airborne. As the war moved toward the jet age, the P-38 stood as the ultimate expression of twin-engine propeller design. It was large, complex, and expensive, but it offered a combination of speed and range that changed the map of the war. It was the heavy hitter of the American arsenal, a plane that looked like the future and fought like a demon. The Vought F-4U Corsair, the Whistling Death. The Corsair is perhaps the most badass-looking plane of the war. Its bent gull wings weren't a stylistic choice. They were a necessity to keep the massive 13-foot propeller from hitting the ground while keeping the landing gear short and strong. It was a plane built around a monstrous engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, the same engine that powered many medium bombers. Initially, the Navy hated it. It was nicknamed the Ensign Killer because it was difficult to land on a carrier. The long nose made it impossible to see the deck during the final approach, and the landing gear was prone to bouncing. So the Navy gave the Corsair to the Marines, who flew it from land bases on islands like Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. In the hands of the Marines, the Corsair became a legend. The Japanese nicknamed it Whistling Death because of the eerie sound it made during high-speed dives. It was rugged enough to operate from unsinkable dirt runways and powerful enough to carry a massive load of rockets and bombs to support the troops on the ground. The story of the Corsair is one of redemption. Eventually, the British Royal Navy figured out how to land them on carriers by using a curving approach that kept the deck in sight. The U.S. Navy soon followed suit, and the Corsair eventually became the premier carrier fighter, outperforming even the Hellcat in many categories. Pilots like Greg "Pappy" Boyington and his Black Sheep Squadron turned the Corsair into a household name in America. It was the hot rod of the Pacific. It was fast, it was loud, and it was incredibly tough. It could take a 20-millimeter cannon shell to the wing and keep flying, a trait that endeared it to the men whose lives depended on it. The Corsair's service didn't end with World War II. It went on to fight in Korea, proving the longevity of its design. It remains a fan favorite at air shows today, its unique silhouette and the deep growl of its radial engine serving as a reminder of the brute force required to win the war in the Pacific. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the 7-ton Jug. If you asked a pilot which plane they'd want to be in if they were being shot at, the answer was almost always the P-47 Thunderbolt. Nicknamed the Jug, short for Juggernaut, it was the largest single-engine fighter of the war. It was so big that British pilots joked you could dodge a German's fire just by running around inside the cockpit. The P-47 was built for one thing: survivability. It was armored like a tank and powered by a massive radial engine that could keep running even with several cylinders shot away. There were documented cases of P-47s returning to base with trees embedded in their wings or hundreds of holes in their fuselage. It simply refused to die. While it began as a high-altitude escort, the P-47 found its true calling as the ultimate ground pounder. Armed with 8.50 caliber machine guns, it could shred a locomotive or a column of tanks with ease. After D-Day, P-47s roamed the French countryside, making it impossible for the German army to move during daylight hours. The Jug was also a master of the dive. Because of its immense weight, it could outdive almost any plane in the world. A P-47 pilot who found himself in trouble could simply point the nose down and get out of dodge at speeds approaching the sound barrier. It was a heavyweight boxer that could move like a sprinter when it had to. For the American public, the P-47 was the symbol of over there. It was the plane that cleared the path for the infantry, the big brother that watched over the GIs in the foxholes. It wasn't as pretty as the Mustang or as graceful as the Spitfire, but it was the workhorse that got the dirty jobs done. By the end of the war, the P-47 had established a record of destruction that was unmatched. It proved that sometimes size and strength are the most important qualities in a fight. It was the mechanical embodiment of the American spirit: big, loud, incredibly tough, and virtually unstoppable. As the sun set on 1945, a new sound began to fill the sky: the high-pitched whine of the jet engine. Almost overnight, the 7 Titans we've discussed became relics of a passing era. The P-51s and Corsairs were parked in boneyards or sold to smaller air forces, their day in the sun ending as the Cold War began. But their legacy wasn't just in the aluminum, it was in the world they left behind. These aircraft were the catalysts for a technological leap that usually takes centuries compressed into just 6 years. They changed how we travel, how we defend ourselves, and how we view the globe. The smaller world we live in today was mapped by the pilots of the Spitfire and the P-38, men who saw the curvature of the Earth while dodging flak and tracers. Beyond the technology, there is the human element. For every aircraft mentioned, there were thousands of mechanics who worked in the mud, thousands of factory workers, many of them women like Rosie the Riveter, who turned bolts with precision, and the pilots who trusted their lives to those machines. The story of these planes is the story of a global effort to stop a darkness that threatened to consume the future. Today, a few of these Warbirds still fly, maintained by dedicated crews who refuse to let the history fade. When you see a Mustang or a Corsair at an air show, you aren't just looking at an old plane. You are hearing the same roar that a nervous 19-year-old heard before taking off into the unknown. The transition from the propeller to the jet was the final chapter of a romantic, terrifying age of flight. We moved from the feeling of the wind to the precision of the computer. But no matter how fast we go, we will always look back at these 7 machines with a sense of awe. They were the peak of mechanical artistry, forged in the hottest fires of human history. They flew so that we could live, in a world where the sky is just the sky, a place for travel and wonder rather than a source of fear. That is their true victory. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to support us.